Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, on page 1252. Page 1252, Aleph Resh Nun Beis. And to sum up where we are, so middle of discussing, after the long discussion of the maturation, growth, and development of emotions, mutfe, murgish, muskel, ibur, unique, moichin, and now the emotions mature to the point of b'chol ma'idecha, which is completely beyond their own initial subjective interest, but their natural love for godliness, but in a way that's negay b'nefesh, in the deepest possible way. And that too elevates and impacts the mind, and the mind impacts the emotions back and forth. We come now to the elevation of Malchus, the Malchus, which is the lowest of all the spheres, as we connect to the event, as we return down to this world and engage in existence, connecting it and interfacing it with godliness. That Malchus too goes through 3 stages of Aliyah, also Ibri, Unique, and Moichin, which he compared to Biti, Achesi, and Imi. The daughter being recipient, Malchus as it's a recipient and a makabel, like a servant that does mitzvahs, Kabbalah soil. Achesi is an equal, as a sibling to Zah, and it receives from Chachma and Bina, Abba v'Ima equally, even though it's like a younger sister to an older brother. But it receives, and it's like the Tanoim Amaroim Poskim, and they use their minds, and that's their Aveda of understanding Torah and delving into it and deriving from it guidance on halachas, so like ministers and advisors to the king, which instruct in turn Biti, the Eved, the servant. And then finally, Imi, on page 1251, Omnam Chines Imi Zer Sheneshama Shem Lamayla Mahatera Umashpiyim B'Tera. This is our souls are mashpia in Torah. So Torah itself is the level of Zah that's involved in the Piskei Hamidus, as he called Piskei Hamidus, Kosher, Pasul, Tomei, Tahir, Chayiv, Zakai, Chesed, Gvura. And that's coming from a lower level in Bina and Chachma, Nihi, as he said, Netzach and Heda Nihi, which conceals to the point that it like the energy recedes, the Eris, says Misha Memis Atzma. Mi Bina Memis Atzma is like killing itself. It's sacrificing itself to be mamshech into Zah. So then there's a level that's the neshamas even higher than Torah that come from Atzmus. He calls it Atzmus HaChachma L'mayla Ma'Torah. Shnei Dvarim Kodma Le'elam. 2 things precede the world: Torah and Yisrael, and Yisrael precedes Torah. Tzavas B'nei Yisrael. Because neshamas receive Torah, but not just in Atzilus, like being Imi, Bina, the mother that's mashpia into Zah, into Torah, but also in the root, the Sheirish neshamas in Ak comes from Primius Ak, whereas Torah comes from Chitzenius Ak. Kuchabrich is Takol Barais. The Torah, the God looks into the Torah. Kuchabrich is referring to Malchus of Ein Sof, which is the root of neshamas, and then even higher, when you get to, which is the level of Primius Ak, Atik of Ak, and then there's even a higher level, or even Atzmus Lifnei Atzimtzum, Neshamas Yisrael Mishroshim Ba'atzmus Ein Sof, and Torah is rooted in Chachma of Ein Sof. So so even in the highest levels, Neshamas are rooted higher than Torah. And even though the last thing we learned on paragraph, this new paragraph on page 1252, that Torah is one with God, but that's in Giluyim Mina Atzmus. And that sense, Torah has a milah, because in a revealed way, Torah is revealed godliness. It's the wisdom and the desire of God. That's why when a Sefer Torah walks into a room, people stand up. If neshamas are higher than Torah, why don't we stand up when any Jew walks into a room, even if he's not a scholar or your teacher or your Rebbe? Because the neshama, like he says, is kamei davar b'fnei atzmei. because the neshama is, in its root, is higher than Torah and the etzem. But when it comes to Giluyim, Torah is more revealed godliness, as he explains in chapter 4 in Tanya, as I discussed. So you actually need Torah and Yisrael. But be'etzem, neshamas, avol k'moshem ba'atzmus, and neshamas en lamayel metera, she'em mishroshim ba'atzmus mamish. I'm reading from the fourth line of the new paragraph on page 1252, the last line we read, kavyach, so to speak. So that's a summary of what we've learned, which is all part of the obvious theme of interface in Ayin Beis, but here it's still talking about the levels of Bina, Mides, now Malchus. So we have the Biti Achesi Imi has been spelled out in the context of recipient, the teacher equal, and Mashpia into Zah, which is the Neshamas, and that's from the level of Imi Bina. That's higher than the Bina, the lower level of Bina that engages with the Midas of Torah and Niglas. In a way, what he said on page 1248, when he spoke about Rajbi, so he said there, the language was that in the godless Hameichin should radiate in Zah, that so there he said that is like Rajbi, by Rajbi, then halachas ha-Torah, where you only see the revealed part of Torah, like we said, Chesed and Gvura, you should see the inner secrets, what he calls the Seder Pnimius, that Rajbi saw the Seder Pnimi within the Torah. That's like the Ava B'chol Moedecha, that higher level that comes the Atzmus of Bina, in which connects with Chachma, and both receive from Arich and Atik as they gaze at the forehead of Keser, of Arich, which draws the energy of Atik. So that is the level of Imi. I saw that in the Shalah, he says, when he speaks about Biti, Chesi and Imi, similar, he says, Tzemach Tzedek brings it somewhere. It's like the difference between a student, a chaver, a colleague, and a teacher. So Biti, daughter, Malchus is like a student, Chesi is a colleague, like a chaver, and Bina, Imi, is like a teacher. The teacher of that is higher than the chaverim, or the brothers and sisters in this context. Okay, I'm ready to continue, but in case anybody wants to ask anything, here's a good time. Because now he's going to continue with the discussion how neshamas are higher than Torah. This is going to go for the next page and a half. He's going to bring tshuva as an example that neshamas are higher than Torah, and the proof is that you can transgress Torah and still do tshuva, which means that neshama is greater than Torah. We'll talk about the difference between Torah and what's higher than Torah. And then he's going to go back to B'chol Me'edecha and conclude the topic of this whole discussion of the last 25 pages of all these levels that will then finally go back to Gan Eden and Olam Haba. They go back. I'll obviously explain it when we get there. Does anybody want to ask anything? No? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. I was thinking about it. Might be premature or just discard it, but oftentimes the Torah and Chassidus explains our relationship to Hashem as a husband and wife, a wife. And I don't see this in this discussion. I'm just wondering, is that covered by a Chosi, or is that not relevant, or what would you say about that, the relationship as a wife?
Between whom and whom?
Between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael.
Well, you could say that's the level of Abba ve'Ima, like Bina, because Bina is the mother. So a mother has a father, husband and wife. You could say that. And in Zah, it's more like brother or sister or siblings. And Malchus is a daughter. But he doesn't say it because the Pasuk, the Medrash rather, only talks about three levels. Zaz mechavavan nikra biti, achesi imi. You have daughter, sister, mother. So he's speaking in those three levels of Aliyas HaMalchus. But if you want technically to place it, Chachma and Bina is like husband and wife.
No, because there's as you had mentioned earlier, these are different medrashim. These three levels are brought from different.
No, that's one medrash. That's one medrash.
Oh, that's one medrash.
Yeah, that's one medrash. Yeah, if you go back on page 1249, he cites the whole medrash. So he says, talk about a king who had a daughter. He treasured her very much, and did not. It persisted. He continued to love her till the point that he called her daughter. Then he continued to love her to the point he called her sister, and to the point that he loved her till he called her mother. That's the medrash.
Right. I see. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So we continue now the parentheses on line 4 of the new paragraph on page 1252. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So it says like this. And I should say one thing before we go to the parentheses. I discussed this a while back. I remember I even gave a footnote, a source rather. In the Sichos in Chelik Tazayin. I think it's Chelik Tazayin or Chelik Chaf Aleph. Look at the Sichos, either Chelik 16 or Chelik 21. For some reason I can't remember which one. I think it's 16. He speaks. The Rebbe said a siyum, I think, in Tav Ayin Beis, a Masechta Chagiga. So the Truma Sicha is the nigla of it, and the Vayakel Sicha is the Primis HaTorah. It's very worthwhile learning in this context. Talks about Neshamas and Torah, how they each complement each other. Because why do you need both? If Neshamas Yisrael v'Kutche Brichu Kul Achad, and we're a chelik elakama mal mamish, why do you need Torah? We come down to this world, and the neshama has all the power it needs. Mashbi and Esei, Tihit Tzadik, has all the faculties and resources necessary to change the world and make it a dira b'tachtein. So what's the role of Torah? So basically, it's the difference as he explains there, and it's really based on Tanya, chapter 4, and other places. The neshama is the agent of God's. It's a divine agent in this world, but an agent needs resources. So yes, the neshama Meir Hashem Nishmas Adam, the neshama of a person like a flame of God. Even more than that, Vayipak Ba'apav Nishmas Chaim, we're a child of God. But a child is still separate from the father. And what Torah does is awakens and reveals the connection and gives us the tools to actually implement it. So really, there are like two roles. One, Torah plays the role of Torah Oyer. Torah Oyer, it illuminates the path. The neshama in this world, if it doesn't have a Torah, it doesn't know where to go. In other words, our inner spiritual instincts of the soul are not enough to know what to do or what not to do, because God put the soul into a body, an animal soul, and it concealed. The whole Torah that we learned in our mother's womb was forgotten consciously. So how do we know what's kosher, what's not kosher? How do we know I'm walking on this path? Do I go down this road or that road? Comes Torah Eir, which is the blueprint that the architect wrote of creation. It's like the life's operator's manual. So now the divine agent called the neshama looks into the life's operator's manual written by the God that the neshama is a piece of, and it has direction and clarity and gilui. So Torah is not just a flashlight or a lighthouse. It's also that, but Torah is actually divine in nature. So it's not a sideshow, it's the blueprint of all of existence. As a matter of fact, Torah reveals to the neshama even what the neshama is like. How do you know what your neshama is like? You have to learn Torah. How do you know the neshama is a chelik elokam mal mamash? We learn in Torah that. It's a pasuk, a Tanya, vayipach ba'apar nishmas chaim, a pasuk in Torah. Chelik elokam mal mamash. So Torah itself reveals to the neshama what the neshama is all about. And it also reveals to the neshama its faculties, moichin, midas, and its garments, machshava dibra mais, and tells the neshama, teaches the neshama, and the neshama looks into Torah to know what it itself is capable of, and not just capable of, but what it's supposed to do. So there, in a beautiful way that the Rebbe explains, like Oyer is not just Megala, the power of the Yesh, it actually is Mamshich, the power of the Yesh, from Elikus. So even though the Yesh HaNivra is Mitziusim Atzmusei, comes only from Atzmus, not from Oyer, but Oyer is the carrier. So you can say Oyer is an illuminator. It's the level of Gili, carrying divine energy in a revealed way. The neshama is rooted in the etzem and comes into this world, and in a revealed way, it's separate. Like we said earlier, he said it's yetzim v'nifradim, yotzu v'nifradu min hakelim, because the neshama has to have independence. In other words, Torah without neshama doesn't have a way of being implemented in this world. The neshama engages in this world, uses Torah as its illuminating guide and blueprint, and there Torah and Yisrael Yachad come together and they transform existence into a Dira B'Tachten. So then the Tana Dvelyo that we read, where he says both of them preceded existence. And then he says, but I don't know which one preceded which. So here comes the question. Afterwards, he answers. We know that the Tzav is B'nai Yisrael, the Neshama is ours. So why did he ask? Why don't I know? Why any Yedea? You do know at the end. Why do we need to know that he first had a suffix, a doubt? So in a very powerful Sichos, Kisove Tov Nun Aleph, also talks about this subject a lot. Why Neshamas are higher than Torah, but the proof is Pikuach Nefesh, Decha Kol HaTorah. If Torah was higher than Neshama, then a life-threatening situation, Torah precedes Neshamas. But since Neshamas precede Torah, that's why the Chai Bahem, if there's a life-threatening situation, the Torah itself says, I'm sanctified by saving a life. Eating Chazer on Yom Kippur is a mitzvah if it's going to save a life, if it's the only way to save a life. Because Neshamas are higher than Torah. But at the same time, they both originate in the same place. That's why he says, Eini Yedei. The Rebbe says there, because Eini Yedei, it's L'mayla Medas. It's L'mayla Medas. And then in that very level where they're both equal, one precedes the other. So it's not like saying, we say Torah and Neshamas are precede existence. Bereshis, B'shvil Yisrael, B'shvil HaTorah. So you can say, one second, once Neshamas precede Torah, so Torah is on the same level as the world. No. The world is existence. That's the structure of existence. That comes from a level that is building the house. You need to build a house. The purpose of the house is two, is Neshamas and Torah. But in that itself, Torah is Neshamas precede Torah. So Istaka B'Reisa Bara Alma and Alpayim Shana Kodma Torah Le'elam, Torah still precedes existence because it's the blueprint and it's divine in nature. The world is not divine. It's a divine creation, but it's not divine in nature until you reveal the divine in it and you transform it. The Neshamas are divine because they're the very piece of the Etzem. Etzem Kishatefes B'Miktsasa Tefes B'Kulei. Torah is revealing the Etzem, but it's the main point is the revealing of the Etzem. And both together, they have the power to transform existence. So here's some sources I just gave, Vayakel Chelik Tazayin and Kisove Tov Nun Aleph. They're both edited, obviously. One is the Likutei Sichos, volume 16. The other is in Sefer HaSichos Tov Nun Aleph, volume 2. Among many, many other places, this is discussed. So it gives a little more understanding of the difference between Imi, why Neshamas are mashpia in Torah in this context. We learned this also. He referred before to Sheftim Habei. The Maimorim that are discussed in volume 1 also talk about this. That there's the way we receive from Torah. That's when we are in a state either biti, daughter, where we learn Torah to understand Torah. So that Torah gives us guidance. But then it says by David HaMelech, it was mechaber Elikus into Torah. There's mashpia into Torah, bringing Torah drawing from the etzem into the giluyim of Torah, which is what we're talking about here. Now, the parentheses, he's going to continue this theme. So he says like this. But I'm reading now the fourth line, paragraph 2, the new paragraph on page 1252. But Ayin Mashakosah b'Likutei Torah b'Dibra Maschil l'Hove Mashakosah b'Atzmus Chaim P.1252 Beis. So this is a very classic mimer. We've talked about it a number of times. One of my mom that talked extensively about Tzimtzum, Rishimu. So it's a mimer printed in the Hisofis at the end in Likutei Torah Vayikra. After B'Chukosai, you'll see there's some additions, and one of them is called the mimer L'Hovin Mashakosah b'Atzmus Chaim about the Tzimtzum. So in chapter 2, so he's now citing something that says there that's relevant to our discussion here. The Inyan, there he talks about the Inyan Ki'imcha Mokar Chaim. Now literally Ki'imcha Mokar Chaim is a very famous verse. Chassidus brings it very often from Tehillim. Ki'imcha Mokar Chaim. So literally it means Ki'imcha, with you is the source of life, is with you, God. In other words, God is the source of life. When Chassidus talks about it, Ki'imcha Mokar Chaim, that God is higher than everything, so he says like this. So what does he say there in the Likutei Torah? Shagam Mokar HaTainugim Hurak Imcha. The Chassidus focuses on the word Imcha. With you means you are far higher than it, than the source of life. Ki Imcha Mokar Chaim. It's only something that comes along with you. It's like a companion, but it's secondary and tuffle. So Chassidus says, there in that mimer he says, what's Mokar Chaim? That Mokar Chaim includes also the Mokar HaTainugim, the source for all pleasures. Hurak Imcha. It's only with you. It's lo Atzmus mahuse. So in other words, you can't define God and say God is the source of life. You say ki imcha, because if that's the case, the pasuk should have said ki ata Mokar Chaim. You are the source of life. Why do we say imcha? With you is the source of life. Instead, poetically, it has a certain poetic element to it. Flourish, a poetic flourish. But kimcha, so the diuk is ki imcha, because you're not defined by being a source of life. It's like oil. God gives off light, but he's not defined by being a source of life. So even the highest sources of pleasures, which we're still going to talk about, is Torah. And then there in the Maimar Likutei Torah, afterwards he writes, Atzmus Yisbarach hu Mokar HaTainugim, that the core of the essence of the divine is Mokar HaTainugim, is the source of pleasures, the Mitziyusei Ma'atzmusei, which means what he uses in Ageres HaKedesh Simachav, because his existence comes from his own inner essence. Everything Mitziyusei is not Ma'atzmusei. Your existence, my existence, comes from somewhere. We have a Mokar, we have a source. Whereas Atzmus is the only thing, Mitziyusei Me'atzmusei. Its very source is itself. So it seems that the first half of the Likutei Torah, the piece, and the second contradict each other. Because the first part says, Imcha Mokar Chaim, that the Mokar Chaim, Mokar HaTainugim is only Imcha, and Atzmus is higher. And now he says, Atzmus is Mokar HaTainugim, Mitziyusei Me'atzmusei. So which one is it? Yesh Leimer. So he says like this, Shezehu b'chinas shashuyim ha'atzmin de Torah. The Mokar Tainugim, the first statement, is referring to the very essential core playthings. Shashuyim is like when you play with something. So it says in the pasuk, ve'eye shashuyim lefanav, referring to Torah. It's like shashuyim lefanav. These are the things the king plays with, but not play. Obviously, play doesn't mean here in a trivial, frivolous way. It means it's his sources of his innermost pleasure, what the king takes most pleasure in his inner sanctum. So it's called Shashim Atzmim. So when the God creates the world, for example, you can't call it Shashim Atzmim. The world is what he wants. But what is his thing? If you say Shashim Lefanov, which means Shashim Atzmim, what is his thing that is most precious to him? So it says that's the Torah. Okay. So that's the tainug of the Torah. That would be Mokeh Chaim. Ubchinas tainug atzmi mamish. And the tainug atzmi mamish, which we need to distinguish. What's tainug atzmi mamish in contrast to shashuim atzmim? Shemisham sheidish anashamas. From there comes the root of the souls. Okay. So let me try to explain this a bit. I mean, based on what I said before, I think the best way, easiest way to explain it would be everything in existence you can say God created, but you cannot say is a reflection of the very innermost personality of God, kavyachol, if you say personality. Because you could also say, as I've discussed many times through Ayin Beis, that God created a world, but the world has nothing in common with him, except that it's God's creation. Created trees, birds, daimim, tzemeach, chaim, edaber. So obviously they're all created by it's God's art. This is his art. So it reflects his internal wishes. In other words, every bird reflects something of godliness, or else, just like a beautiful piece of art, every piece of the art reflects the artist. But there's nothing very much in common between the very core essence of the artist and the art. The art is his expression. Now, God could have created the world that way. The problem would be, what was the purpose of it? Why does this artist need to create art? So that's where we get back to the reasons for creation. So some say, in Eitz Chaim, he says, similar to an artist. Why does an artist create art? Because he's revealing his inner potential, his inner possibilities. Like anyone has potential. We all have potential. We want to actualize our potential. We want to fulfill your potential. But Chassidus right away says that can't be the real reason, the ultimate reason. That could be a reason on the level of Atzilus, but it can't be a reason for Atzmus, because why does Atzmus need to be fulfilled? He's not missing anything. A human artist, you can say, a human artist is not perfect. A human artist, the difference between potential and actual, just because he could be an artist, it's still not fulfilling until he actually creates art, like we see in everything. A business person, just because he could create a business doesn't mean he did create a business. But when it comes to Eibishter, you don't say that. So then what is the purpose? So there are different reasons given. He wants to give, tevatev lehetiv, that the world should know him. But all these reasons, Chassidus negates as being the ultimate. It says these are legitimate reasons, but in the shtalshlus. Ultimately, when it comes to Atzmus, it's nesava kadosh baruch hu liyas leis baruch dira b'tachten. He desired a home in this world. Why it desired? There's no question on a desire. But Atzmus wants a dira b'tachten, and it's not to be more complete. It's not to actualize himself. The Rebbe has all Sikh and Shmois in volume 6 in Likutei Sichos. The second Sikh of Shmois elaborates, and it's actually based on Maimorim and Ayin Beis in volume 2. Yeah, the end of volume 2. That it's not doesn't have to fulfill a logical purpose, like let's say a human artist creating art. But to make a dira b'tachtein means something. It means that Atzmus is not separate from this world. He wants to be this should be his home. God's home is in Atzmus. He's not in Tachtenim. Based on what I said before, Daimon Sameach Chaim Edaber, they are creations of God. They are pieces of art. They're God's artistry, you can say. The portrait which he creates. Or say Maisa Etzbe Esav. It's the product of his fingers. Yes, he created creation. And each piece of creation carries something of God, what God wants, just like we say the 10 spheres. Chochmah reveals Chochmah of Hashem, Bina is Bina of Hashem, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Netzach, Chod Yesod, Malchus. And from them evolve all creation. There are things that carry Chochmah in this world, the wisdom of nature, for example. And there's Bina and Das, there's Chesed manifests in water, in love, Gvura in fire, and in awe or reverence. So you can find the godly divine dimensions in everything in existence. But that's not a dira b'tachtenim. That just means that God created something. He created a structure called the 10 spheres, the cosmic order. He then created these spheres, evolved till they become physical entities in this world. But that doesn't make a difference. That just says God created art. That's like an artist creating art. What happens next? You don't need anyone now. God created the world, but he created a human being. Suddenly comes into the picture on the 6th day of creation, suddenly enters the human being. The human being is a new creature, new type of creation, different than everything else. It comes from Ofer min Adama. Yes, that's true. The physical body comes from the earth of the ground, the earth. Vayikach Hashem Elokim Ofer min Adama. But then comes the main thing. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. He breathed into it soul of life. P.1252 Tanya. Chelik elokam emal mamish. This, the 6 days of creation, no fish, no animal, no plant, no flower, no star, sun, moon, the heavens themselves, light, none of them have they have a divine spark, a divine energy, for sure, that's giving them and sustaining them every moment, but it's not coming from the innermost personality. First time God, so-called, manifests and transfers from his innermost personality, so to speak, into existence is the human being. But the human being alone, as we said, needs guidance and direction. It's true. Before Chetei Tzadas, Adam and Chava probably had that divine instinct, but they also had the free will, because God put them and created them in a way, Yesh HaNivra, in a way that they have an independent choice, free will. So God gave Torah to go hand in hand with this neshama. The Torah will be also comes from my innermost self. The Torah is not like another bird, God forbid, or outside element of creation. It's not just a piece of art. It's coming from the artist's very mind of the purpose. You want to know why I created you and for what purpose. I will reveal it through the Torah. Is also a raisa v'kutshabrichu kulachad. So here you have two things coming from the etzem that when they work together will be able to transform the art into a dira ta'atzmus. Now, as we spoke earlier, the difference between them, one is more giluyim, reveals God's intentions, and also tells us all that we need to know about what to do and who we are, the neshama, that's called Torah. But it's not just like I said, it's not just a flashlight, not just like a light you turn on in the room. So without the light, the room is dark. You don't know how to deal with all the elements in the room. If in a dark room, you don't know where's a chair, where's a table, where are the steps. You turn on the light, Torah air, you know everything is in its place, how you're supposed to deal, what's kosher, what's not kosher, what's allowed, what's not allowed, direction and guidance. But the Torah is more than just light. The Torah is also from the innermost plan of God. The same Atzmus that said, I want Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, said, I want the place in Torah, reveals that. I'm telling you what my deepest intentions are. If you just had science, for example, you could understand all the many mysteries of Daimem Tzameach Chaim Medaber, of all the natural earth or the natural world. Science is good enough for that. Science is also God's mind, but it's God's mind as understanding, like we would analyze a piece of art made by the artist. You wouldn't necessarily know what is the deepest intentions of the artist. That's why scientists on their own can't tell you why God created the world. They can tell you what he created. And they can lead us to the Big Bang, or they can lead us to whatever they logically lead us to, but they can never tell you why God created it. That's why science does not have that answer. Science cannot even tell you the answer to morality and ethics. Science is neutral. Science is a neutral, I'm talking about pure science, not the political science, meaning science that's politicized. Pure science is analyzing, is dissecting the world, evaluating it, and trying to understand God's mind that's invested in Chachmas HaElam, tremendous wisdom. Chachmas HaTorah tells you what God wants you to do with this world. No scientist can tell you that. You know, the greatest quantum mechanics, and Einstein himself, all of them cannot tell you why God created. They can tell you what he created and how he did it and what makes it tick and how we can manipulate it for technology purposes or for medicine or for whatever else that we use it for, to access its energy. But why? There you need a glimpse into God's very core mind. Hashem says, Bereshis bara Elokim, Bereshis b'shvil ha'Torah b'shvil Yisrael. I created it for a purpose, to make a dira b'tachtenim. That's what Torah tells us. So Torah is revealing to us the inner purpose of the art, not just the wisdom of the art itself. Yisrael, Neshamas, are the ones that implement it because they carry the very power of Atzmus. And that's where these two come together. So here you can explain like this. So Torah is Shashuyim Atzmim, meaning it's the closest thing to God as what God takes pleasure in his innermost wisdom, if you wish. And even more than wisdom, the very pleasure that he has from all of creation and its deeper purpose and all of existence. And the Neshamas are the very core of the divine itself, because they are the implementers. Torah without Neshamas is just a book. Yes, it's a divine book. It's a Raisa v'Kutche B'Chul Kul Echad. It's all one, but it's not active. It's not animated. It would be sitting in an ark like Simchas Torah. We are the legs of the Torah. We dance with it. When we learn Torah and we implement it, Torah comes alive. Like he said before about the Tanoim HaMiroyim, that without Moichin, the Torah just sits there. Pia Chochma, he said, where did he say this? It's a very beautiful way he put it. That Torah with Moichin, the Torah, Akiyum, yeah. What does that mean? Why is the Torah not preserved or perpetuated or sustained without someone that is dying for it or committed to it? Because if without that, the Torah is just is God's, yes, it's God's inner wisdom, gewaldic, but there's no implementation. The Misha Memis, when Bina, like he said, sacrifices itself and completely commits to Torah, then you have the legs of Torah. We are the arms and legs. We are living Torah. We make Torah come alive, because without it, Torah is just God's plan, so to speak, God's inner plan. So Neshamas are essentially chelik alekam and mamish that bring alive the Torah. The Torah gives guidance to the Neshamas. That's why in Giluyim, Torah it has that mila because it guides us. But ultimately, the Neshamas are higher because they're rooted in the very etzem of bringing this into reality, a dira b'tachtenim. So Adam and Chava, the Neshama, comes from this etzem, what he calls Tainu ga'atzmi mamish. Torah is shashuyim ha'atzmim. So Tainu ga'atzmi, basically, you could say it doesn't even have any revelation at all. Torah has shashuyim ha'atzmi. They are revelation. God, the king, the God, is taking pleasure in it. And that's the difference between Ki'imcha Mokar Chaim, that's not Mehusa Atzmusei, and Mokar Tanugim Atzmusei, Mokar Tanugim HaMitzusim Atzmusei, which is between Torah and Neshamas. And then he adds, Umasha Kosev, the Mitziusim Atzmusei. So the Alter Rebbe adds in L'Kutei Torah the words Mitziusim Atzmusei, which only refers to Atzmus. Torah does not have that. Yeshlei Meshazeh Inyan Shmei Kadman Kikadmusei. That is when we say, it speaks about it in some, it says, in the Maimer Vayelach, famous Maimer Samach Vov, where he says there's a level that Shmei Kadmusmei, that even though it's not Atzmus Mamish, but it is so part, so one. And that like he says now, next line, I'll explain that in a moment. Shame, which is called Chelis capacity. Shekol b'atzmus mamish, that's encompassed in atzmus mamish. V'usherish b'chinas shmei hagadol. That's the root of the shmei hagadol. Mushroshim shesham mushroshim neshamas Yisrael. That's where the souls of Israel are rooted. And because of this, I'll explain this in a minute. Let me just finish the parentheses. What he said before from the Yerushalmi. And that's why the Shema got the great name, which is Malchus of Ein Sof, Meshutav Banu, is Tafke Meshutav, interwoven within us. That's the word I would use. Interwoven within us, meaning within Jew neshamas. Matasa l'shimcha Meshutav Banu. Okay. Let me explain this and then I'll stop for questions. This is a very, very high levels he's talking here. It's probably the highest I have seen described in explaining where neshamas are rooted. So here we have it. Here's what we have. It's only applicable to us. It comes from itself. Even Ein Sof, which doesn't have any existence of its own, it's completely bottled. But you can't say Mitzusim Atzmus because its raw source is Atzmus, is the place where the light comes from. So you can't say Ein Sof, even the highest levels, Mitzusim Atzmus. I've talked about this at length a while back. We spoke about three expressions that are reserved only to Atzmus. Mitzusim Atzmus, built in Mitzias Nimtza, and Mechuyev HaMetzias. I'm not going to talk about the other, but it just an existence that does not have any existential personality, which means you can't call it exists. You can't say it doesn't exist, so you say it exists in a non-existential way, meaning it exists not in a way that we would define as existence. This chair exists, this table exists, I exist, you exist. We manifest in a certain way. You can't say on Atzmus that he exists the way we exist. And the third, B'chuyev HaMetzias, means he must exist. Everything else is optional. Even the Oyer didn't have to be. Atzmus is not capable of not existing because it's total, absolute reality. Okay, I want to go back to Mitzusim Atzmus now because that's what he's using. So in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Chof, Alter Rebbe introduced this word. I don't believe anyone ever used it before the Alter Rebbe. I'm almost sure it's not, but I want to triple check. But regardless, Mitzusim Atzmus, he uses an Atzmus, and he actually uses it in a very interesting way. He says, the only thing, the only one who can create yesh ma'ayin, a yesh that does not feel it has a source, is only something that has no source. The yesh actually has a source, it just doesn't feel it. Who could create such a thing? Only Mitzusim Atzmus, yesh amiti, she'en le'ilu v'siba acheres chaz v'shalom shekodma lo chaz v'shalom. Chaz v'shalom at the end. So Mitzusim Atzmus is reserved only for Atzmus. On the other hand, Torah then, let's talk about Torah first. Torah, we know, is not a creation, like all the other creations. It's Kodma La'olam. It precedes existence also qualitatively. It's God's very essential wisdom. But more than wisdom, we can't even use the word Chachma on those levels. It reflects God's innermost intentions, if you wish. I'm just using words just to express it. So where does Torah fit in? Is Torah like Ein Sof? So you could say, hypothetically, yeah, Torah. But Torah is reflecting the very core of the essence. So you could equate Torah to Ein Sof, but you'd have to say Torah is higher because you don't say an Ein Sof. You say Araisa v'kutshe brichu kul echad. You don't say Ein Sof v'kutshe brichu kul echad, even though the truth is it is kul echad, because doesn't have any existence of its own. It's completely bottled. So this is a discussion which I have thought about many times. I've never seen it spoken about directly. That Torah does seem to have the properties of the highest levels of Ein Sof, but because it's called Shashuim Lefonov, it seems to have more than just Oyer. It seems to have something from the Etzem itself. Oyer also has from the Etzem, but Oyer's identity is just revealing, just reflecting, just expressing. Torah is not just revealing, expressing. It does have, we call it Shashuim Atzmim. So Torah, so you'd say Torah is basically where Etzem and Gili meet. That's what I would say. Like the highest levels where Etzem and Gili meet. That's Torah. But what about Neshamas? Neshamas are higher than Torah. And in Likutei Torah, he says clearly, like he said, that there's the level of imcha mokar chaim, then there's mokar tanugim dimitziusim atzmusei. So here comes a level that really was revealed by the Alter Rebbe. With the Alter Rebbe in Vayelech Samach Vav that he refers to here, and we spoke about the Chid says B'zeh Chidush Rabbeinu Shmaseidim Be'inyan Ha'or, that the Alter Rebbe was mechadish that there's a level that's not Atzmus, and there's a level, but it's also not creation. It's called Or. And there he goes into all discussion. It's not even a Ratzon, because Ratzon is already a defined level. Or is undefined. It's like a transparent tapestry, like a field of energy, how I like to define it. Torah is at this highest point, but Neshamas goes the level that has an element of Atzmus in it, and yet it's not Mamish Atzmus alone, because even the word, when you say Mitzusim Atzmusei, that's a description. It's a description that describes only Atzmus, but there's a level where that level of Mitzusim Atzmusei transfers into what he calls here Shmoi Kadman Kikadmusei. That in the deepest levels, the highest levels, the Eibishter created a thing called Yechelis. What's Yechelis? This is the Alter Rebbe used this word. This is the Alter Rebbe's Chiddush. Yechelis means he's kept the capacity to do something. It's not even koyach. Koyach is already a potential. So when you say, for example, a person has a faculty, I can write. There's the koyach haksiva, the power to write. There's the power to write within the soul. But then there's a level, it's called, that the highest level has yechelis, the capacity to do something. So on one hand, it's not done yet. On the other hand, it's one step removed from Atzmus, because Atzmus is not defined by capacity either. So Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe says, this is Samach Tzedek, the Maimorim, and the Rebbe Rashab explains in the Vayelech, that the level of Yechelis is called Shem, or more specifically Shmei HaGadol. A name is nothing but the one that carries the name of a name. But like he says in the words, Shmoi Kadman Kikadmusei. It's the only thing that is primordial. It's Kadman Kikadmusei. It's just as Mitzusei Matzmusei, that Atzmus comes from itself. Also, this level comes from itself because it's really Yechelis Atzmus. So it's not Atzmus alone, but it's not category. And that's why he uses the word Mitzusei Musei. So Yashlem Mitzusei Matzmusei, Shekol Matzmusei Mamish, and that's the root of Shmei HaGadol, where the souls are rooted. The root of Shmei HaGadol. So, what we have here is the deepest level like the Yesh HaNivra will become Yotzav Nifradu. It will ultimately, what it says, Elakush Shanasa Yesh. You could perhaps say, and this is a perhaps, I'm not positive about this, because sometimes the Yesh HaNivra refers to the body. But you could say that here's where the neshama has an element of Yesh HaMiti in the Mitzusei Matzmusei, in the being, because it's completely a piece of that etzem, which would explain chapter 2 in Tanya a bit more, Chelik Elikam B'Mal Mamish. And yet it still needs Torah to express and reveal it, because even though on its highest levels it's rooted there, and he's going to actually qualify this shortly in a, he's going to qualify this, I believe, on the next page. At the end of the paragraph on page 1253, that in its root, this is how it is. Later, the neshama will obviously develop its own independent identity, but it still retains this highest level of atzmus within it. Now, I hope I did justice in explaining this, but I'm happy to stop now if anybody wants more explanation on this. So just to sum up, Neshamas and Torah In Atzilus, neshamas is bina, imi, when neshamas are higher than zah, Torah. In higher levels, it's chitzenius adam kadman, ak, and pnimius ak, that draws, the atik of ak, that draws from malchus of Ein Sof, which is Shmei HaGadol, like he said earlier, and even higher than that, in Atzmus Ein Sof, Neshamas Yisrael is Mushish in Atzmus Ein Sof Mamish, and the Torah is a Chachma of Ein Sof, and Neshamas Ein B'chinas HaAtzmus. So now, in the highest levels, it ultimately will evolve. The Neshamas, as they're rooted in this level that he called Tainug Atzmi, it will go down into Malchus of Ein Sof, which is Shmei HaGadol, later Pnimius Ak, all the way to Bina Vatzilus. And the Torah, which is Shashrim Atzmim, that he calls Tainug Shashrim Atzmim, will become Chachma of Ein Sof, then Chitzenius of Ak, and then Zah Vatzilus, in the different levels he spoke here. So they're all, Neshamas always higher than Torah in this level. Just the question is where we're talking, from the highest levels down to the lower levels. And of course, there's when Torah is mashpiyah to Eden, that's when we're like biti, the makabel. But that is what he says so far. Again, does anybody want to ask anything?
What about the level of, sorry. What about the level of Shmo, Kadmon, K'Muso?
I just discussed. That's what I just explained.
You said Shmo HaGadol.
So if you read it, he says that this is Shmei Shekol Batzmusi Mamish v'hu Sheirish b'chinish Shmei HaGadol. That's the root of Shmei HaGadol, where neshamas are rooted. So there's a root for Shem HaGadol in the Shem Sheshmei Kadmon K'Kadmusei. Which is Malchus of Ein Sof, and that's what he says. Begins Malchus of Ein Sof, Meshut Ban. It depends where you're talking. If you're talking the highest levels, it's Shmei Kadmon K'Kadmusei. That is the root of Shmei HaGadol, Malchus of Ein Sof, where there's rooted in Shamas Yisrael. But it all originates in this highest level of Atzmus Yechelis. Okay? Good.
I keep thinking, Rabbi Jacobson, that when we say these highest levels of Atzmus, as you said, you haven't seen it maybe expressed so deeply anywhere like this, but it's still the creator, the Eberster, the Ein Sof, the Etzem, talking, relating to, as he is, wants to be a creator of Torah, creator of Neshamos, creator of Adira Patachtonim. But couldn't you say that there's still a level of Atzmus that has nothing to do with any of this? Not Dira, not Torah, not Neshamos, because that's still only one aspect of his desire. He's Haveh HaKodesh Baruch Hu Adira Patachtonim, but that doesn't necessarily reflect on truly, he's much more than a creator. He's much more than wanting a Adira Patachtonim. Isn't there a level of God that has nothing relationship to any of us, any of this? That's really Panemius Atzmus, so to speak. We only talk about one desire to have a Adira Patachtonim. There could be much deeper aspects of the artist, the ultimate artist. That goes way beyond the desire for a house or a neshamas. It has nothing to do with any of this. It is real Panemius.
The response to that is as follows. If you take that logical conclusion, basically the world, Torah and neshamas, are all basically equals, because Atzmus is beyond them all. And that's not correct. So let me explain. You can have, as I said, the artist creating a piece of art that expresses a part of him, but not the totality of him, because he may not even be an artist. Right? He's beyond being an artist. So the art reflects one piece of the artist, but not the art. The artist is not defined by his art. Then you could have that the artist creates something. I don't want to say creates, because creation works on art, on the world. He emanates. We call it more like Oir or Atzilus even. It's an emanation. You don't call it a creation because it's expressing who he very much is. So let's say this piece of art that's hanging in a gallery, everyone marvels at it, and the artist suddenly decides to send a messenger of his son, into the gallery, and his son starts talking about the artist. He suddenly realized, 1 second here, this art is beautiful and reveals a lot, but the artist is completely far, far more than that. But the son, because he's a very son of the artist, he can express something of the very core essence of the artist that would be in the art. That's when the Shamas and Torah come in. They aren't just another dimension. They actually, God invested a piece of himself through them more than he did in all of creation. And that's why they're called Kaddish, holy. The rest of creation, is the art. Now, is it true to say that Atzmus beyond Torah and Yisrael too? So you could say two different ways to explain it. You could either say yes, period, that there's dimensions, even though Torah and Yisrael are coming from Etzem, that's for sure, but still, Atzmus is not defined by them either. But there's a problem with that. Because remember, we're not talking about another creation. Torah and Yisrael are not another creation. They are a reflection of the very core essence. That's what Hashem wanted. Part of God, and that does not go to this data, you could say is, we don't know many dimensions of Atzmus, so to speak, dimensions. Because as much as high as we go, Torah and Yisrael, you may not know, but it's still carried in it. It's just like a son or a child carries the very genes of its father. That doesn't mean that the son or anyone else knows all those genes. It's just in there. So you could say that when we, neshamas, connect through Torah and fulfill God's will and taiva to make a dira b'tachtenim, whether we understand it or not, or we can contain it or not, all of Atzmus is in there one way or another. Even though Atzmus is completely beyond any descriptions, including words like or Shem, Shmei, Kadmuse, or Shashuim, or Torah and Yisrael. Because there's a point where Torah and Yisrael themselves lose their own identity, and all you have is one God. At the end of the day, we only have one Eibishter. The only thing is, Torah and Yisrael are so bottled and so much part of God that one Eibishter expresses itself through Neshamas and through Torah. So you could say both ways, that either some things are completely beyond, and that's that, or that beyond itself also manifests, which is what I would lean toward, because that's what the Eibishter wants. But it's like when we say etzem kishatefes b'miktsase atatefes b'kulei. What does that mean? An etzem, you're grasping a piece of the etzem, that's like a neshama or Torah. We're not talking about the world. The world is not a piece of the etzem. The world is an expression of the giluyim of the artist. We're talking about a piece of the etzem, yotefes b'kulei. In Tanya chapter 4, he says that when you grasp the king, even though you're grasping his garments, you're embracing the king himself. So even though we're grasping Hashem, that less machshavet tfisa beklal, no one can grasp him. But he's manifested himself through Torah. So through Torah, when we learn Torah and our minds become one with it, it says we are embracing the king. So even though we may not relate to all the dimensions of the king, but we're still embracing all of him. So in that sense, you could argue Atzmus, that's still beyond everything, also being somewhat in the picture, except we don't have direct access. So it's like there behind the scenes. Because if you say how you were suggesting that Atzmus is completely removed, then you get to the point. So what was the whole exercise for? To reach what level exactly? We don't reach Atzmus anyway. We only reach Atzmus as it relates to Torah and the Shos. We're calling it Atzmus. He's not calling it highest levels of Giluyim. That's why it seems to me that you would have to say that. So you don't have to, it doesn't, like the Rebbe says, there's levels of that we will never understand. It doesn't have to, it defies logic. We will never understand. And even the word unity, that we unite with God there, even that means nothing. But nevertheless, somehow it seems that Atzmus is negated, that this is one, or the interface Paying all this effort only ends up connecting us anyway to a level that's not ultimately the full picture of Atzmus. That's why I'm leaning towards saying what I'm saying, the other way to explain it, that we get the Atzmus, but we don't get it necessarily in any way that we can define. So Yechelos takes us as deep as we can in something we can still talk about, Atzmus capacity. But yes, the parts of Atzmus that we will, that so to speak, that are not really accessible except by simply saying it's a complete mystery and unknown. But that too seems to be part of the picture of the Dira. Or let's say that ultimately Torah is wise Torah better than Buddhism, for that matter, if it doesn't get the deeper levels anyway. I mean, lahavdil, if you know what I'm trying to say. Interesting points here to discuss, right?
Very interesting. But, you know, I mean, ultimately, you can just say that God, we're still a limited creation, and we have ability to have the highest level of Yehudim in the times we're talking about today's Tanya portion, for example, in Chitas, about and after Techias HaMeisim, we even have these incredible levels of Yehudim, as like the Mashiach said to the Baal Shem Tov when he went up, that we should be able to do Yehudim komocha, like you. So, but that ultimately, even those Yehudim at the highest levels of Atzmus, where we're Meshurash, the Neshamas and Torah and Meshurash and Atzmus, it's still as a level of a specific kind of limited creation. Call it humanity, call it Adam, call it whatever, a Neshama. But that I would just say that, well, your explanation, and I have to think about it, a very deep explanation there, but more, of course. But I would just say that what's to say wrong with the saying that it's not like we don't accomplish anything. We have these incredible levels of Yehudim. We've gotten to a level of Atzmus, but with still the understanding that even with our ultimate Yehudim that we can hopefully accomplish and will accomplish with the Gula Shlema and Mitzis, even after Techias HaMeisim, there's still going to be a level of Atzmus that is totally higher than any of the levels that we could ever accomplish. And I don't think that's demeaning or belittling.
No, there's nothing wrong with saying it. The question is that ultimate bittul causes you to be able to experience something even though you are not understanding or relating to it. You could enter a place with bittul that is completely beyond as well. So the ultimate bittul of neshamas and Torah should be able to also some way experience that. Doesn't mean experience it that in a way we understand. Logic and Chabad and Chagas Nehim are not relevant there anymore. But that this, so I agree. I mean, listen, even on a very basic level, Torah is Ein Sof. As much as you learn, there's always more. Same thing, even more with godliness. As much as you read, there's always more. That's for sure the case. The question is if that more is in some way. I mean, as soon as you say Torah and Neshamas Amushish and Atzmus, you can't split Atzmus into two pieces. That's my point. You can't say there's the Atzmus we relate to, because Atzmus is not split. You can say there's the Atzmus that we can understand or experience, and there's the Atzmus we can't. But to say that it's completely like off, because you can't split Atzmus into two. That's what you'd end up doing if you go with that approach. If it's Giluyim, it's Giluyim. But if it's Atzmus, you have to have, as I said, Teifus Bekule. However, Teifus doesn't mean, like we spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu, it doesn't mean it's like, Upanai lo yiro, you'll see the faith by not looking. Sometimes it's through not looking that you see, or you experience, whatever, however you define experience. But I think what we're really discussing right now, what means total bittul? Total bittul means we don't even have the capacity to talk about it like we're doing right now. This talking itself is already limiting. But there could be an experience where there's no talk, there's no thinking, you're just in it. And then you're there. And that's it, like the zone. And when you're in it, it could experience something beyond you while it's also you. But there's a lot more to say on this topic, obviously.
Wow, that last part was amazing. I hear what you just said. You clarified something when you said, if you're truly in Atzmus, there might be an Atzmus that you can access, like these Yehudim levels, but then there might be a level of Atzmus you can't access, but you're still there. You're still with it, because you can't delineate and define and divide Atzmus. Either you got it all or you don't got it, even though that all might be something that's not accessible.
That's how I would definitely explain it.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Eliezer, you always go back to a theme, which is you want your cake and eat it too. You want to be there, but also be able to tell about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's true. But it's sort of like what you said about a husband and wife. There's an aspect of your wife you'll never know. It's a mystery. You're one with her, but there's an element that is beyond any kind of, it's a mystery. Always will remain a mystery.
And you embrace it, and that's that. So you know what? It also teaches us that that knowing and understanding doesn't always mean is the most. Who says that's the ultimate? I think in a world of control that we're so used to, understanding and knowing seems to be like we need to own it in some way. Before he said, I'm thinking back at the bottom of page 1249, when he said that. 1249. No, sorry, 1247. He said that you get to a point of primis hamechin, primis hasoge, like tachlis idea shalei neda. What does that mean? The ultimate of knowing is not knowing. The ultimate of knowing is experiencing the unknowable. You could say some of that is that way. It's like, look, you can love someone in the deepest possible way. Your child, your wife, your spouse. That doesn't mean you have to get everything about them. You will embrace someone or your daughter in the most possible way, even if you don't understand everything about them. Because unless the ego and the need for control, but a real healthy parent, when I see this, God forbid, the negatives, where it's your child and your child has done something, has gone away or is behaving in ways that are very far from what you dreamt or hoped for. And yet you still feel that essential love. You love your child no matter what. You're embracing an etzem that's not on any of your terms. You don't relate to it. You don't understand. You don't even approve of it. But you still embrace it. So there's an element of embracing the etzem of your child, and the giluyim are not really there, or some of them are not there. I'm just using a human example, but I think that some of what we're talking, just as obviously with Atzmus is far beyond that because it's not human and not finite in any way. But I just wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you so much. You really clarified an extremely important point for me. Thank you.
Good. So I'm going to stop here. We're going to stop here at the end of the parentheses on page 1252. Now the Rebbe Shab is going to go into a proof from Tshuva that teaches us that neshamas are higher than Torah. And that's going to go for a page and a half approximately.